How a Romance Novel Saved the Galaxy by Ariana de Ralte. Chapter 69. Concordia Pen. Clan Leroy was heading straight for the lift, which was still spilling out Death Watch members. "Got Barker, you cocked Kutang!" growled Django over his gums to their leader. Django didn't like this part of the plan. He doubted any of his Verde did. Certainly not Clan Leori, who mostly stopped their assault except for a few who were gunned down by Death Watch. The two Mandalorians were giving ground to Death Watch inside the factory, not a lot, but they kept holding back from assaulting anywhere around the lift. He had reluctantly ordered the Verd still in the office transmitting to get out of there, as Death Watch sent a group to shut it down. From what he had been told, the office was hooked into an ops center terminal inside the mine. The rescue squads were nowhere near it, or he'd have asked them to secure their broadcasting comms. The good news was that almost all of the Attica were out of the mine at this point, so really they were just holding back waiting to see if Vizsla took the cooking bait. He was taking his time if he was, but it was hard to resist the pull of the battle chants. Django wondered if the Death Watch Verde even noticed they were moving in sync with the chants as they fought. He could almost predict when they would fire based on the pauses within the chants. Suddenly, Newshead whipped around away from the area she'd been fighting. "Vizsla is coming!" Jetty warnings really were handy. "Everyone, fall back! Yes, you Clan Leori! Get ready for the fight!" he ordered. He designated a squad to keep cover fire so Deathwatch wouldn't realize what was happening, but the rest of them left the factory, those on the far side out that entrance, while Django and his group headed for the front entrance near the landing pad. Outside, he was pleased to see that his Verde had investigated the old freighter sitting on the landing pad for traps, since filling it with explosives seemed like a very Deathwatch thing to do, and managed to get it moved out of the way. The Verde who had given the battle chant were now crowded around the edges of it, his boar the only one standing on the actual platform. It was the perfect arena for a fight over the fate of Mandalore. Jaster kept one hand lightly on one of his Beskar Tonfa as he waited near the far edge of the platform. Django's forces were streaming out of the factory or coming around from the back door. He was feeling all wound up from the energy of the battle chant, and judging by the shifting Beskar behind him, so were his Verde. Jocasta and Kamari came around to stand with Jan near the edge of the platform behind Jaster. Django joined them after stopping to chastise a few of their Verde further from the factory door. They were very carefully keeping all their people on the far side of the platform, allowing Vizsla some illusion of safety if he brought his people out. Word came over the comms that everyone was out of the mine, and that the bomb he'd gotten a notification about somewhere in the middle of the chanting had been disabled by Master Yaddle. His relief grew even greater as Deathwatch Verde started streaming out of the factory doors. A full dozen left the door before Vizsla, coward that he was, dared to show his armor. Jaster let out a deep breath. He'd worried Vizsla might decide to bear the shame of being considered a coward by his people, but there were some traditions you couldn't break and still be considered a Mandalorian. One-on-one battles for the title of Mandalore were thousands upon thousands of years old. He turned to the Jedi behind him. "Please don't interfere in the duel. Any Jedi interference could give Vizsla an opening to declare this match doesn't count." Jan nodded solemnly. Jocasta looked a bit sour, but nodded as well. He took off his boucher and handed it to Django for safekeeping. Vizsla wasn't wearing his, so they matched. The Vizsla clan's sigil was marked in red on his pauldrons, and he had a short red cape pinned away behind him. Jaster had his red cape on as well. The light of the setting sun glinting off his own bare Beskar armor meant he'd have to avoid looking directly at it so he wasn't blinded during the fight. "So, a First Mandalore wishes to challenge me." Poor Vizsla was all posturing, his face set in a derisive snarl. Jaster tried to relax and looked unworried by the bluster. There was no one left in that mine to hold hostage and threaten, and the bombs were disabled. Vizsla didn't have the advantages he thought he did, and he had now shown his very punchable face. "I am the true ruler of Mandalore. The Manda chose me. If they didn't, why would I have this?" He thrust out one gloved hand, the hilt of the darksaber held tight. Deathwatch cheered while most of the true Mandalorians yelled denials. "It doesn't matter who holds the darksaber at the start of the battle," said Jaster once they had quieted down. "Only who does at the end. And it certainly won't be you, Darmanda, who hurts and tortures Ade." Vizsla snarled at him, his eyes alight with rage. "They serve the glory of ancient Mandalore. We are "Are you going to fight or talk?" interrupted Jaster, pulling his tonfa out and aligning them with his forearms. He bent his knees slightly, ready for anything that Vizsla threw at him. Vizsla lit the darksaber. It really had an entirely different look from the Jedi's lightsabers, almost seeming like a void in space. Vizsla swung it in a wide, easily dodged arc. Jaster stepped out of range, then in, bringing up his left tonfa to block a return swing, while slamming the point of the right into Vizsla's chest, right below this Beskar. To Vizsla's credit, he didn't double over like some would at the blow, merely grunted and tried to bring the darksaber to bear on Jaster's tonfa. The edge of the tonfa was glowing orange-red where they connected. Jaster flipped the tonfa in his right hand around so the longer end was out that drove it deep into Vizsla's armpit as he took a step back. Jaster smirked as Vizsla tried not to show the pain he must be in. There were some very painful spots in the human armpit if you knew what it hits, and it had the advantage of being a spot without armor. Vizsla attacked again, this time not swinging so wide. Jaster blocked, and they danced across the platform. Jaster was particularly proud of the glancing blow he had landed on Vizsla's jaw with the end of one of his tonfa. So far, none of Vizsla's strikes had hit anything other than Beskar. It gradually dawned on Jaster that Vizsla simply wasn't very well trained in Beskar or lightsaber fighting. He had some practice, but it was nothing compared to a master of the art, and judging by the way his swings kept drifting wide, he wasn't used to the weightlessness of the blade of the lightsaber. There! Jaster stepped into Vizsla's guard, the edge of the darksaber passing centimeters from his right side. He flipped around the end of the tonfa at the same time, so the long end was out and able to pass over the top of Vizsla's joined hands where he gripped the hilt. Down into the join, the long end went. Then Jaster flipped the end over, like he was turning an invisible wheel to the right. The darksaber went flying away. Vizsla let out a cry of rage and dismay. It should have clattered onto the platform, but instead it hovered, then moved to Jaster so he could take it out of the air. Jaster looked beyond the circle of onlookers to see that Obika, looking rather worse for wear, had approached the circle, his hand outstretched. Holdan was crowding behind him, unwilling to let his ad go, with Windu, Yaddle, Sunverde, and a cluster of Atike behind them.
"You cheater!"
snarled Vizsla.
"You need the Jedi's help to win my blade!"
This was what Jaster had been worried about when he asked the Jedi not to interfere in the battle. Not that it was Obika's fault for not being there for the briefing. He cast a reassuring smile the boy's way before switching back to Vizsla, a confident smirk on his lips. He tossed him the darksaber. "If that's what you're worried about, I'm happy to kick your shebs a second time." Now that he had the man's measure, he didn't think it would be hard. Vizsla obviously hadn't had it for long enough to become comfortable with the weapon. Vizsla glanced behind him at his waiting people. He snarled and lit the darksaber again, one-handed this time, so maybe he had learned something. He swung widely in a horizontal slash. Jaster easily backstepped to avoid it. Maybe not. "Just!" came the cry behind him at the same time he noticed Vizsla's hand moving at his belt.
"Alsic!"
The explosion of the thermal detonator should have blown Jaster sky high, ripping into his unprotected head, but instead he was pulled backwards, what he could only call a cushion of thick air around him. He found himself dazed and nearly falling off the edge of the platform. Jan was gripping his right leg while Jocasta had his left. They let go the moment he found his feet, but he was warmed by their care. Jango was shouting orders into his comms to go after them. Vizsla, hot on that he was, had used the opportunity to flee, though as the smoke cleared, Jaster could see that only some of Deathwatch had fled with him. In fact, several were looking between the smoking crater and what he could only assume was the direction Vizsla had fled in, dismay in every line of their bodies. Vizsla hadn't conducted himself as any Mandalorian should, especially their Mandalore. He stood tall on the edge, surprised at what the last of the smoke revealed. There, on the far edge of the crater, improbably blade side down so the hilt was pointing up toward the sky, was the darksaber. Jaster didn't look at the multiple telekinetic Jedi that surrounded him. He strode confidently over the rubble and picked the blade up, igniting it as he did. He'd never held a lightsaber before, so he wondered if they were supposed to vibrate your whole arm before it somehow calmed to a contented buzz. He held it high into the sky. "Oya Mandalore! Oya Mandalore!" The cheer was taken up by his Mando Abe. "Go after that Hutton!" Jango had to shout into his comm to be heard over the cheering. He wanted to relax and congratulate his boar, but Vizsla had fled and the bomb meant they hadn't seen where he had gone. Obi-Wan appeared at his side. "There's a hidden hangar under the mine pit." Holdan and Windu were following, though Windu was visibly cradling his arm.
Ulsic, Bulk, get the squads around the pit on alert. Django looked around wildly. Dooku, Nu, Yaddle, Deathwatch are escaping through the pit.
No wonder the scouting squads couldn't find any sign of Deathwatch's ships outside of the mines.
Unfortunately, it meant that the scouting squads, with their Jedi Knights, were probably deep in the mountains around the pit at this point. There would be no calling them back in time.
We're on it,
said Dooku calmly, tearing his eyes away from Boar. Nu just nodded and broke into a run, Gamadi behind her. At first he thought she was going back in the factory, but instead she did one of those impossible-looking force leaps and was on the roof and still running. Yaddle, meanwhile, went around, disappearing from his sight. Django took off after Nu, using his jetpack, liking her idea of getting high, Dooku and several of his Verde at his side.
Scramble the brooding,
he ordered. That was the nearest gunship that wasn't being used as a medic's base of ops. They came to the far edge of the factory. The ore processing building was below them, and beyond that the mining pit. On the far side of the pit, there was movement near some old mining tents. He used his heads-up display to narrow in just as they were pulled down, revealing two gleaming blaster turrets. Osik! Those blasters were designed to go through vehicles and ships. While Beskar armor would theoretically protect his Verde from the worst, a direct hit would knock them back, and a lucky one would kill them, especially since not every Verde had good Beskar armor. Nu muttered something to herself, then swung what was obviously some sort of rifle off her back. The cloth wrappings were yanked off, revealing a strangely organic-looking weapon with what looked like an old-fashioned lightsaber jammed on top where a scope would usually go.
Are you sure that thing is usable?
Asked Dooku just as the blaster turrets opened fire on the now approaching Verde. Django winced as he watched it mow through the ranks, then fire wildly into the air, trying to hit the Verde who were approaching via jetpack. Their aim wasn't very good, but it didn't need to be when they were firing so many rapid shots. Verde dropped, though he noted that Yaddle was now down there, catching those who fell with the Force. Nu gave Dooku a sharp grin.
Let's see.
She focused in on one of the turrets and pulled the trigger. Kara! Said Jaster, finally beside them. It had probably taken Boar a moment to shake off the well-wishers and get the jetpack to follow them. Kara, indeed. The blast from the lightsaber rifle was wider than Django ever thought possible, over half a meter across. It accurately hit the Durasteel shields around the blaster turrets, then went through them, cutting a neat hole wider than Django's arm through the entire turret. It fell silent. Nu frowned, oblivious to all the stares of the Mandalorians around them, and focused on the second turret. Deathwatch abandoned it, jumping aside just as the second shot easily made another hole. Seconds later, 3 Mandalorian AIAT gunships burst through the bottom of the pit. A storm of blaster fire hit them, but handheld blasters couldn't do much damage to shielded gunships. Django ordered the Prudie after them, though it was already moving to intercept over their heads. Nu casually took aim and fired a hole right through the ion engines on one of them. It spun crazily as only one engine provided thrust. It spiraled off into the mountains, and Django alerted the scouts out there to go find it. He hoped they were lucky enough for Vizsla to be on that one, but from the way the 2 other gunships abandoned it, he didn't think it was likely. Nu frowned down at the rifle, which was smoking, then pulled out the ancient lightsaber before setting it up into the air with the Force. It exploded.
Only 3 shots, I'm afraid,
said Nu to Jasbor. You just saved a lot of lives with those 3 shots, he responded with a smile he only pulled out when he was flirting. Django said. That's still the battle, Django reminded him. Smaller ships and Deathwatch members wearing jetpacks were now boiling out of the pit. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but that never stopped Deathwatch before. The Jedi leapt into the fray, and the true Mandalorians were right there beside them.